I wanted to give you an example of how to make a Gantt chart in Excel from a manual process. I think many of you will find that this way is much simpler than the bar chart method. So just to kind of walk you through the process, let's just get started. So here in the first cell, what I would do is just name your project. So we'll call this an imaging management project. Is just for a generic title. Just make sure you name yours as specific as possible depending on what project you elect to implement based on that list. So then what I'm going to do next is then I'm going to label it in weeks. So I'm just going to call that week 1. Just going to copy that information there, paste it into the next cell, and just give you an example. So several weeks in there. So then I'm just going to go through kind of cell by cell and change those. So we'll call this week 2, week 3, 4. You can kind of get the idea. For your chart, if you can label it in specific weeks, so indicating it more in a date-based fashion, that has a duration of 1 week, I think that would be effective, probably the most effective. That way you can see it in kind of, that real-time type of perspective. So ideally, that's what I would recommend. Instead of generic weeks, you actually establish that official timeline. So we're up to 8, 9, and we'll just do 10 as an example so you can kind of get the idea. So there's 10. So what I'm going to do, let's just style it just a little bit. So I'm going to highlight all of my cells. If you go to this cool little arrow, directional arrow, it allows you to angle them. So I'm going to angle them, just give it a little bit of flavor to it. Then if you double click the edge of the cell, so up at the top, I'm just double clicking, double click. It basically collapses the cell to the size of the text. So it keeps it nice and clean, nice and even. There's several ways to go about this, but I find that this way is probably the easiest. And then so there's the columns. They're all labeled in weeks. So let's label the rows. And again, this is generic. I want yours to be specific. So start to brainstorm those activities. So I'm going to just call that activity 1. Do the same process that I did in weeks. So I'm just using the Control-C to copy and Control-V to paste. And we'll just go down and drop in 10 activities as well. So just to go through these, 1, 2, 3. Again, make them specific. You can also think about organizing them in terms of kind of categories. So it doesn't have to be activities 1 through 10 or 1 through 20. But if you have multiple activities, so say you're implementing multiple pieces of equipment, it could be, activities 1 through 5 for this piece of equipment, activities 1 through 25 for this piece of equipment, and so on. So just kind of keep that idea in mind as well. So you can see the process so far really doesn't take a ton of time. A lot of your thought is just going to have to be go into what are these actual activities. So you can see activity 10 right here is kind of spilling into this cell. So again, I'm just going to, you can either double click it, but when you double click, I'll show you what it does, is it's going to go to the edge of that. So instead of that, I'm just going to grab it, move it over, and then have that information there. I'm going to give it just a little bit of solid feel to it. So I'm going to give all borders. Okay, so all cells are now labeled. There, so you can kind of see what that does with the angle, makes it look kind of cool. So we're going to say that activity 1 is going to be completed in 1 week. So you can label each activity with a different color. I did activity 1 in yellow, but then if you wanted, each one of them as a different color, that's fine. But if you have multiple subsets, so multiple imaging multiple imaging information topics, you can then label those with, this activity is, or this subset is all yellow, this next subset is all green, and so on. But let's just kind of go in and show you how this works. So we'll label that one green, and say that, this one, you can see that this is a predecessor activity. So activity 1 has to be completed before activity 2. We'll say that activity 2 and 3 can be completed together, but activity 3 is actually going to take a little bit longer to be complete. And then we'll say activity 4 is dependent on activity 2, but not on activity 3, so it's only going to take 1 week, for example, so we can see that. And you can kind of go in, so on and so forth. So think about those parallel activities, think about those predecessor activities, what can work together, what has to be finished before the next thing can move on. And that's essentially how you're going to be able to set your Gantt chart. Now, in terms of, we'll say that you had activities 1 through 5 here for one major idea. Just divide it off into block lines, kind of what you're seeing here. And then you can say, for the next series or the next piece of equipment, just start the labeling over again. So it really depends on what you want, the look and feel, but it should give you an idea of what's happening when, so I know exactly what's going on in week 4, what should be starting, what should be finishing accordingly. Nice and easy process, nice and clean, and I think it'll really speed up the timeline in comparison to that bar chart. So if you have any questions about the manual process, be sure to let me know. The only thing that I want to kind of reiterate, just so you can kind of get familiar with Excel, if you highlight all of the cells for the title, you can use this merge and center button. Okay, and then you can essentially have your title in the actual center of your cells as well. Let's bold it. It's thinking here, and then we can increase our font size, and you can see how it automatically increases as well. So there we go. That is, in a nutshell, a Gantt chart from a manual process utilizing Excel. Enjoy!